For 500 years, millions of people have stood in front of it and felt something they couldn't quite explain. Not just reverence, not just awe, something closer to the feeling that the painting is looking back at them, that there is more happening inside that wall than any human eye has ever been able to catch. That Leonardo da Vinci, the most relentlessly curious mind in the history of Western civilization, did not simply paint a scene out. He buried something inside it, and he buried it so deep, so carefully, so brilliantly, that it took 5 centuries and the processing power of artificial intelligence to begin pulling it into the light. What is being found inside the Last Supper right now, hidden beneath layers of paint, encoded in positions that look random until they don't, buried in decisions that appeared purely artistic until science revealed they were something else entirely, is rewriting what we think we know about this painting, not in the way of sensational conspiracy theories or fictional Da Vinci codes, in a far more unsettling way, in the way of verified, documented, scientifically examined evidence that the man who painted this masterpiece between 1494 and 1498 on the wall of a Milan monastery was not just making art. He was making something that operated on multiple levels simultaneously, something that could be seen by anyone, but understood only by those who knew how to look. This is the story of what modern technology is finding inside the most studied painting in human history, and why what it's finding is changing everything. To understand what's at stake, you need to understand what the Last Supper actually is, not the reproduction you've seen on calendars and coffee mugs, like the real thing. A mural approximately 4.6 meters tall and 8.8 meters wide, painted directly onto the plaster wall of the refectory, the dining hall, of the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. It was commissioned by Duke Ludovico Sforza, one of the most powerful rulers in Renaissance Italy, and it depicts a single electrically charged moment from the Gospel of John. Retold at the instant when Jesus tells his 12 apostles that one of them will betray him. Every figure at the table is reacting. Every face, every hand, every body is frozen in the precise second that this announcement detonated in the room. The shock, the denial, the anger, the grief, 12 different human responses to one unbearable truth, captured with a psychological precision that no artist before Leonardo had ever achieved, and that very few have matched since. But from the very beginning, the Last Supper was dying. Here is something that most people don't know. Leonardo made a decision when he started this painting that was, by the standards of his time, almost recklessly experimental. Traditional murals in the Renaissance were painted using the fresco technique, applying pigment to wet plaster so that, as the plaster dried, the paint became chemically bonded into the wall itself, essentially becoming stone. It was permanent. It was durable. It had worked for centuries. But fresco technique demanded speed. You had to paint each section before the plaster dried. You had to commit to every stroke immediately, with no time for second-guessing, no opportunity for revision, no room for the kind of obsessive, gradual refinement that defined everything Leonardo did. Leonardo refused those terms. He was not a fast painter. He was not a painter who committed easily. He was someone who could spend weeks staring at a face before touching it with a brush, someone who returned to works repeatedly over years, adjusting microscopic details that no one else would notice. So instead of fresco, he developed his own experimental technique, painting with tempera and oil directly onto dry plaster. This gave him the control and flexibility he needed. It also created a painting that began deteriorating almost before the paint was fully dry. Within 20 years of its completion, visitors to Milan were already noting that the Last Supper was damaged. By the mid-1500s, the great historian Giorgio Vasari, who saw it in person, wrote that the painting was already so deteriorated it was little more than a blurred stain. What followed was 5 centuries of compounding catastrophe. The refectory was used as a stable by Napoleonic soldiers who threw food at the walls. A doorway was cut directly through the lower section of the mural in the 1600s, destroying the feet of Jesus and several apostles forever. The painting survived Allied bombing in 1943, though the rest of the refectory was nearly destroyed. The mural stood exposed to the open sky for years before the building was rebuilt around it. And across those centuries, the painting was restored multiple times by well-meaning but damaging hands, each restoration adding new layers of paint, varnish, and shellac that obscured more of Leonardo's original work even as they attempted to preserve it. By the late 1970s, the situation was critical. Italian authorities ordered a complete scientific examination of the wall, sonar tests, radar, core samples, infrared cameras, X-rays. What they found was alarming. What Leonardo had originally painted was buried beneath at least 4 separate layers of restoration work spanning 3 centuries. The authentic original was barely visible. In 1978, a conservator named Pinan Brambilla Barcelon was appointed to do something that had never been attempted before. Not to restore the painting in the traditional sense, but to excavate it. to carefully, systematically remove every layer of later intervention until she reached whatever remained of what Leonardo's hand had actually created, and then to stabilize that, honestly, without inventing what was no longer there. She worked for 21 years. Her process used infrared reflectography, ultraviolet fluorescence photography, and chemical analysis at every stage. When the work was finally unveiled to the public in May 1999, the world saw something startling. The painting was brighter than anyone had imagined, more chromatically alive, but also visibly, honestly damaged. Large areas were simply gone, replaced with light watercolor fills that Barcelon had painted to make the losses visible without deceiving the eye. What remained, though, was authenticated original Leonardo. And what the scientific imaging used during that restoration had revealed, in the underdrawing beneath the surface and the layering of pigments, in the microscopic decisions captured by infrared cameras, laid the groundwork for everything that would follow. Because it was the data gathered during that restoration, combined with new generations of imaging technology and computational analysis, that gave researchers the raw material AI would eventually learn to read in ways no human analyst could manage alone. Here is where things get genuinely extraordinary. When AI systems were applied to high-resolution multispectral scans of the Last Supper, scans that captured not just visible light, but wavelengths across the entire spectrum, revealing layers invisible to human vision, they began identifying patterns in the painting that had never been recognized before. Not because the information wasn't there, but because the human visual system, no matter how trained or expert, processes information serially, one element at a time, and can only hold so much in active attention simultaneously. AI doesn't have that limitation. It processes everything in parallel. It can track the precise position of every brushstroke, every hand, every object on the table, every architectural element in the background, and the relationships between all of them, all at once, identifying patterns that emerge across the entire composition simultaneously. The first thing that reoriented researchers was something that had been noticed before but never fully understood: the mathematical architecture underlying the composition. The Last Supper is not just a painting, it is a theorem in geometry. Leonardo was a mathematician of the first order. He understood perspective, true, rigorous, geometric perspective, more deeply than virtually any artist before him. And he deployed it in the Last Supper with a precision that computational analysis has now mapped in extraordinary detail. The vanishing point of the entire composition is not arbitrary. It is positioned exactly at the right temple of Jesus, at his eye level, just to the right of center of his face. Every perspective line in the room, the ceiling beams, the tapestries on the walls, the edges of the table, converges on that single point. The eye of every viewer is physically directed by the geometry of the painting itself back to the face of Christ again and again, regardless of where you look. You cannot escape it. The composition is a machine designed to control the experience of every person who stands before it, pulling the gaze back to the center with the inexorability of gravity. But the AI analysis revealed something inside this geometry that even mathematically sophisticated art historians had not fully articulated. The architectural space Leonardo painted behind the figures is not the room the painting is hanging in. It is a precise mathematical extension of it. The refectory itself, where the painting sits, was designed to appear as if the walls of the painting are a continuation of the actual walls around the viewer. When the painting was new and the room was intact, a person entering the refectory would have experienced something close to a visual illusion. The sense that the table at which Jesus and his apostles sat was simply at the far end of the actual room they were standing in. The Last Supper was not a window into another world. It was designed to collapse the boundary between worlds, to make the sacred moment feel physically present in the same room as the viewer. Then there's the music hidden in the bread. This discovery was made in 2007 by an Italian musician and computer technician named Giovanni Maria Palla, and it has been described as plausible by Leonardo expert Alessandro Vezzosi, director of the Leonardo Museum in the artist's hometown of Vinci. What Palla found, after years of studying the painting, was this: when you overlay the painting with a standard 5-line musical staff, positioned so that it runs between the tablecloth and the face of Jesus, on the positions of the loaves of bread on the table and the hands of Jesus and the apostles correspond precisely to musical notes. Each piece of bread, each positioned hand, sits on a specific line or space of that staff. They are, in the language of music notation, notes. But when Palla first played those notes in the order they appeared reading left to right, the way Western eyes naturally scan a painting, they produced nothing recognizable. No melody, no musical sense, noise. It was only when he reversed the direction, reading the notes from right to left, that the composition revealed itself. Right to left, the direction of Leonardo's mirror writing, the direction of every private notation Leonardo made in his thousands of pages of journals and sketchbooks, the the direction that anyone who had studied Leonardo's personal writing habits would immediately recognize as his characteristic signature. Played in that direction, the notes form a 40-second composition that Pala describes as sounding like a requiem. Slow, solemn, haunting, appropriate to a scene depicting betrayal, death, and sacrifice. A piece of music embedded invisibly in a painting for 500 years, waiting for someone to think, to read the painting the way its creator wrote. And Leonardo was qualified. He was not just a painter who happened to appreciate music. He played the lyre. He designed and built musical instruments of his own invention. His private notebooks contain musical riddles, also written from right to left. Music was not a casual interest. It was another language in which he thought, another dimension in which he understood the world. The idea that he encoded a composition into the Last Supper, using bread and hands that already carried specific religious symbolism, eyeing the bread as the body of Christ, the hands as the instruments of blessing, fits everything we know about how his mind worked. What AI pattern recognition has added to this understanding is the capacity to examine the relationships between all the elements of the painting simultaneously, and ask questions that a single human researcher, working from one angle at a time, could never fully investigate. When computational analysis tracks the gesture of every hand in the painting, it reveals a choreography of astonishing complexity. The 12 apostles are divided, as Scripture describes them, into 4 groups of 3, but the gestures within and between those groups are not simply expressive. They form a visual counterpoint, a back and forth of motion and stillness, open and closed, that gives the composition its extraordinary rhythmic tension. It breathes, it pulses. It has the internal dynamic structure of music, which is perhaps the point. The food on the table, analyzed in detail by researchers at the University of Montreal and is subjected to further computational study, tells its own story. The presence of bread and wine is expected. These are the elements of the Eucharist, the body and blood that Catholic theology holds Jesus consecrated at this meal. But the table also holds what appears to be eel and citrus, sliced oranges arranged as garnish. The significance of these choices, for a man who painted every element of every composition with deliberate intent, continues to generate scholarly debate. Some researchers argue the eel and orange were common Renaissance delicacies, suggesting the wealth of the setting. Others argue Leonardo, who was a vegetarian in an age when vegetarianism was almost unheard of, made specific choices about the food for theological and personal reasons that still require full unpacking. And there is the question of Apostle John. The figure seated immediately to the right of Jesus, the figure that Dan Brown's novel famously but fictionally claimed was Mary Magdalene, is depicted with strikingly delicate, almost feminine features. This has been a source of controversy for decades, and AI analysis of multiple versions of the Last Supper has added a fascinating dimension to the question. Multispectral scans conducted at the Abbey of Tongerlo in Belgium, where a large early copy of the painting has hung for more than 450 years, I confirmed something extraordinary. The face of John in that copy shows a highly delicate sfumato technique, Leonardo's signature method of blending tones without visible edges, that is distinct from the other apostles, whose faces appear to have been painted by assistants in Leonardo's workshop. The sfumato on John's face appears to be Leonardo's own hand. He painted John himself with a care and delicacy he did not extend to most of the other figures, giving that face a specific quality that stands apart from everything around it. Why? What did that face mean to him specifically? The answer that the painting itself offers, examined with every tool modern science can bring to it, is that Leonardo was doing something in the Last Supper that goes beyond illustrating a gospel narrative. He was building a device, a machine made of paint, geometries, slight and encoded information designed to work on multiple levels simultaneously. Surface and depth, immediate emotion and hidden structure, the sacred story on the wall, and the mathematical and musical intelligence embedded within it. He was creating something for multiple audiences at once. For the monks of Santa Maria delle Grazie, who would eat their meals beneath it every day, for the Duke of Milan, who commissioned it, for the future scholars he knew would come, and perhaps for some interior audience of his own, leaving traces of how his mind worked in a language he knew most of his contemporaries could not read. The tragedy embedded in all of this is that we are working from ruins. What AI and multispectral imaging and infrared reflectography are analyzing is not the Last Supper as Leonardo finished it. It is what survived. The authentic original that remains on that wall, after centuries of damage, restoration, more damage, Allied bombs, Napoleonic soldiers, humidity and time, represents only a fraction of what once existed there. Leonardo's original color choices, the precise palette of a man who had theories about optics, light, and perception that were decades ahead of his time, are partially gone. The exact expressions on faces that were entirely repainted in the 18th and 19th centuries before Barcelona stripped those additions back are lost. The feet of Jesus and 3 apostles, cut away when someone decided they needed a doorway through that wall in the 1600s, are gone permanently. What we have is enough to understand that what we're looking at was extraordinary. What we don't have is everything Leonardo put there, which may be why this painting keeps generating new discoveries. Because the more sophisticated our tools become, the more precisely we can ask questions of what remains, and the more those fragments answer back in ways that suggest the whole was even richer than the ruins imply. Each generation brings better technology to the same wall in Milan, and each generation finds something the previous one missed. Infrared cameras revealed underdrawings that showed Leonardo's compositional process, how he adjusted the angle of a head, repositioned a hand, reconsidered an architectural element before committing it to paint. AI pattern recognition reveals structural relationships between elements that no human analyst tracking one detail at a time could perceive across the whole. Multispectral imaging distinguishes between pigments laid by a master's hand and those laid by his students, mapping which portions of this 450 square foot composition Leonardo personally touched. And with every new layer of discovery, the same conclusion keeps reasserting itself. This was not a man painting a picture. This was a man compressing an extraordinary density of intelligence, visual, mathematical, musical, theological, psychological, into a single object. A man who believed that the deepest understanding of the natural world and the deepest understanding of the sacred were not in conflict, but were expressions of the same underlying order, and who encoded that belief into the arrangement of bread on a table, the position of every hand, the trajectory of every perspective line, the geometry of a room designed to dissolve the boundary between the world of the painting and the world of the viewer. What AI is revealing is not a conspiracy, not a secret code designed to embarrass institutions or upend religions. What it is revealing is the mind of one of the most complex human beings who ever lived, still speaking across 5 centuries through the only language that survives him. And the longer we look, and the better our tools for looking become, the clearer it becomes that Leonardo da Vinci hid things in this painting not to deceive us, but because he understood that the truth he was trying to express was too large, too deep, and too layered to fit in any single surface reading. He painted the meal. He painted the betrayal. He painted 12 human faces in the worst moment of their lives. And then, inside all of that, he painted everything else he knew, waiting for the eyes of the future to be ready to see it. We are starting to be ready. And what we're finding, layer by layer, frequency by frequency, pattern by pattern, is that he was right to wait. It was worth it.